is we're going to be going in and finishing more civil rights movements, but with other minorities other than African Americans. So again, we're on this sheet on the front of the page. So, overall, we're going to start with feminism. So if you see the feminine mystique, and then right below that you see something called Roe v. Wade, if you want to bracket that and say feminism, that's what this is. So if you guys were here for the practice exam, where it asked the question on women's rights during the 60s and 70s, there were literally two terms you could have used. Which are these two terms?
For what?
For if you had, well, you didn't do the essays on Saturday. Didn't you leave early? Yeah.
Okay, I was like, wait, was that one?
So the SAQ that was on women's rights, this is what they were referring to. Now what happens is in the 1950s, we're going to have a book come out called The Feminine Mystique. And what happens with The Feminine Mystique is that The Feminine Mystique is basically going to be a book that's the modern day feminist book. So if you want to put next to this like feminist book, this starts the feminist movement. Now what happens is that basically Betty Friedan, who's on the right, is going to say that women in America are under what's known as the domestic mystique. Domestic mystique. And basically what the domestic mystique is it's basically saying you are a domestic housewife. When you're born and you're female, you're expected to be cult of domesticity all the way and not break from it. Now, this is what Betty Friedan says. The feminine mystique succeeded in burying millions of American women alive. Basically, you were trapped into this box as being a woman, and you couldn't escape it. Now, she began to really advocate and feel like women needed to push it out. But at the same time, just because you have feminism doesn't mean you get more rights than a male. So, for example, a girl should not expect special privileges because of her sex, but neither should she adjust to prejudice and discrimination. So you should be able to get rights, but that doesn't mean your rights trump a male's rights as well. Well, then you're going into a very big debate on, okay, that is not appropriate. That's not appropriate. Seriously, Dax. Okay. So, there are different forms of feminism. All the forms of feminism are completely acceptable, whatever you think. Okay? Alright. So, where this whole thing is coming from, and it kind of begins the modern day women's... It begins the whole modern women's liberation movement in order to be able to move away from this domestic goddess idea. So what I want you to do is on this paper, go ahead and flip to the second page. Now, I know you girls in here have always wanted to know how to be the perfect wife. So the good news is that I have this nifty little guide on how you too can be a perfect wife in the 1950s. And men, here's what you need to look for, because this is the good wife's guide to being a good wife. So it says things, for instance, like when he comes home. So this is all talking about coming home. So it says things, for instance, that says, listen to him. You may have a dozen important things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Let him talk first. Remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours. Or saying things, for instance, of make the evening his. Never complain if he comes home late or goes out to dinner or other places of entertainment without you. Instead, try to understand his world of strain and pressure and his very real need to be home and relax. So, your goal, try to make your home into a place of peace, order, and tranquility, where your husband can renew himself in body and spirit. Don't greet him with complaints and problems. Don't complain if he's late for dinner or even if he stays out all night. Count this as a minor compared to what he must have gone through during the day. Make him comfortable. Have him lean back in a comfortable chair. Have a drink ready for him. Speak in a low, pleasant voice. This is one going into some of my favorites. Don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he is the master of the house, and as such will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. A good wife always knows her place. Okay? So women during this time, this is what you were expected. You were expected to be a good wife. Every day when they come home, you're bright and ready to go, dinner ready, kids ready to go. The guy comes home, you do anything you can to make him happy, And that's basically what your goal is. That's why it says, greet him with a warm smile and show sincerity in your desire to please him. Your goal is to make men happy. This is what Brady Freedom is trying to break. She wants to make it clear that you can be whatever you want to be in. And this begins the women's liberation movement throughout the United States. And people begin to advocate, we need more rights in America for women. And this is going to culminate in the very, very important, 4-star term, Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history. What happens is this. You have this woman on the left, Norman McCorvey, who at the time is anonymous. That's why it's called Roe v. Wade. It's because her pseudonym is the Jane Roe. So what happens is that she is going to be 22 years old. She gets pregnant out of wedlock. And what happens is she wants an abortion. Well, the thing is that at this time, you actually could not just go off and get an abortion. Abortion was typically only legal if you had rape or incest issues, or the mother's life was in danger. So she goes to the doctor and she lies, and she says, I was raped, and I want this baby to be aborted. Well, they can't find any records. They discover that she's lying. And so what happens is that the woman on the right is going to sue in her behalf as Jane Roe. They're going to say that a woman's right to choose must be constitutionally protected. The government cannot restrict this. And all this comes around abortion. So, you have one side. This is really the pro-life and pro-choice debate. This begins in 1973. So the idea is, do you have the right to choose as a woman? Or is this abortion just murder? Is this just another way to be able to say abortion is okay to everybody else? And this pro-life, pro-choice debate is going to become rampant throughout the United States. Now, in the end, this is what happens. It is determined, and this is what you really need to know, abortion is legal in America. You cannot ban it. Now, they're going to say you cannot ban abortion in any way. However, there are ways to restrict it, but there's not necessarily a way you can just say you can't have an abortion whatsoever. So this is where we start to get our abortion laws in America. So, for example, here in Utah, one way they can restrict it without actually taking it away is you're required, if you have an abortion, you must speak for at least 1 hour with somebody who is certified to tell you other options and also go into graphic detail of what happens in an abortion. Because a lot of times it's a scare tactic, scare you away. Or, for instance, what they'll do in other states, that is the really controversial one, is that when they go to make a Planned Parenthood building, they'll change building codes and it'll all of a sudden be illegal to have any medical practice in there. Yes?
I'd like to apologize for my outburst and say that this is what got me heated. Sorry.
That's okay. No problem. So, which we'll talk about abortion in just a second. I just want to point out one more thing. This is a kind of an interesting turn of events, by the way. So, Norma, this was in the 70s. In the 80s, Norma comes out and she actually switched. So, Norma went from pro-choice in the 70s, and she actually was pro-life by the 80s. Now, in terms of impacts on today, this is something that just happened 2 days ago. There's a law that's been passed now in Iowa that officially becomes into law January 1st, known as the heartbeat law. Now, heartbeat laws are very controversial. There's been times that they've tried this before. However, it's been struck down by the Supreme Court in those states, so we'll see what happens here. Basically, what it says is this. You can no longer have an abortion once you can hear a fetal heartbeat, which is typically at 6 weeks old. Why that's important is because most women, on average, find out that they're pregnant at 7 weeks. So, in theory, is abortion banned? No, but it basically bans abortion in another way. Now, the challenge is going to be, does this violate Roe v. Wade? Now, they did this in Ohio a couple of years, or 2 years ago as well. And Ohio Supreme Court knocked it down. They said they did not feel that this was constitutional. Iowa, I'm sure, is going to be challenged right away, because this whole idea of what abortion rights are allowed and not allowed comes through that. Now, as time has gone on, there have been adjustments made. So, for example, Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood does receive federal funding. However, those federal funds cannot be used for abortions, because if not, it gets this whole Roe v. Wade. But it does fund other things such as giving people birth control or making people aware of their options. Well, you have other, so for instance, with Obama supported that. Trump doesn't, has taken away that funding. So this whole idea of Roe v. Wade is all throughout the United States. It's massive. They can ban some abortions, though. So third-term abortions, late-term abortions can be banned. But the small ones cannot. Does that make sense? Yeah, but there are ways to get around this law without completely banning it. Yeah.
So, like the last slide, when you said that she switched, was that the
Yes.
one that sued on the person's behalf, or was she the one that...
No, this is the one that actually had the abortion or wanted the abortion. By the time the court case went through, she ended up already having the kid, and I believe, if I remember correctly, she ended up giving it up for adoption. And then in the 80s, she said that was the worst mistake. She said her view is that this court case took like 4 years to get through the courts, and she said about halfway through she actually had changed to pro-choice or pro-life, where she had changed it and said this isn't worth it. And she later said she regretted ever wanting an abortion in her life. It's just kind of an interesting fact about it. Anyways, so any questions in general about Roe v. Wade? Highly controversial. Okay. By the way, following this Supreme Court case, the only other Supreme Court case that might come up, it hasn't come up yet, but it's considered one of the top Supreme Court cases, is going to be the gay marriage law in 2014. So that's the next one, yeah.
Did they talk about
2015.
Lopez versus U.S. or whatever? Like
No.
that gun control one?
No. The only one they're saying might come up is the gay marriage one. Because they're saying that was one of the most important pieces of legislation.
You know what that's called?
It's like so the thing is that it's actually like 25 Supreme Court cases that all combined into one, and they picked one name basically. I think it's like Scheller. I think it's Scheller something. But as long as you know the approximate date is about 2014, 2015, you'll be okay.
I thought it was in July of 2015.
Yeah, summer's around that time period. The important thing that you need to, it hasn't come up yet, but they're saying that's going to be the new Supreme Court case that'll be on there.
It's in like practice books.
In theory, period 9 can be all the way up until present day.
Yeah, but I mean, but they usually don't put very much.
Really, the only thing they put in period 9, they can only do one stimulus on it, and it's usually on Reagan. They've also had one on globalization, which is literally everything that you already know about globalization. Basically, we export all of our goods. Okay. Good? All right. So, next minority. We're going to head into Cesar Chavez. Now, Cesar Chavez is going to be a Latino immigrant. Beginning in the 1950s, we have a massive immigration in America from Latin America, in particular Mexico. Well, what happens is we have what's called the Bracero program, which is basically where we're going to allow migrant farm workers from Mexico to come into America to work. This is where Latin American immigration skyrockets in America. Now, what happens is basically following World War II, we didn't have enough farm workers, so this adds 1.1 million farm workers into America. Also, it's controversial. Part of the start of illegal immigration is people who overstayed their visas. So all this kind of contributes during the same time. Regardless, though, Cesar Chavez says these migrant workers, though, are not fairly treated. As you can see right here, one way to get rid of lice, spray them with pesticide. And if you don't know, remember Agent Orange? That was spraying from the sky. Imagine having it sprayed directly onto your skin. Or, for instance, when you worked out in the fields, you started to have low pay. You didn't have enough money to survive. And so it begins what is known as the Delano Grape Strike, which is why there's grapes on your page. Not grapes of wrath. Delano Grape Strike.
Is it actually crazy?
It really is grapes. So what happens is that basically all these migrant farm workers on the grape farms begin to say, we are going to strike. So they walk off the job. Additionally, they advocate for all of the people in America to not eat their grapes. So basically, all of this comes up and it destroys the grape market and factory work in America. And basically what the result of all of this is that this movement is going to boost up rights for these Latino migrant workers. Basically allows them to unionize, it gets them higher wages, and it provides more opportunities for migrant farm workers in America. Yes?
Just random question, sorry. On a visa, do you have to have a job
Yes.
to keep your visa?
Yes.
So they all get their visa?
So it's different than a green card. So a green card is just for migratory purposes. It's an immigrant. So when you are on a green card, your idea is to permanently reside in America.
Yeah.
On a visa, A visa is a short term, and you have a stipulation. So you can have a celebrity stipulation. That's how Justin Bieber was able to come in back. That's how they almost deported him, is because he was on a visa. Or you can have one for student visas. So you can come to school here in America and get a visa. But there's a thing called a work visa, which is what this Bracero program was, that basically says you're coming to work. Now that's temporary. You can reapply for the visa, but typically after 2 years you go home. But what happened is most of them stayed their visa. And at the time, we didn't really have like ICE or anything like that, so nobody was going after them. It's part of the reason why that's like the start of illegal immigration. Latino migrants begins in the 70s. They overstay their visas. Yeah.
Didn't we just yesterday like make a rule that everyone that crosses the border legally is like prosecuted?
The one I was seeing yesterday has legally entering in legally. Illegally, yeah. The intention is to automatically prosecute. I know the big one is not that statement that he said. The big one that he said yesterday is that when they cross the border, children will be separated from their parents. That was the big one that was said, and that parents will be deported quicker than children, and it'll separate families. But, I mean, they're cracking down. The one thing that he basically said is that there's going to be no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's not going to be any nice guys in this whole situation. Everything's going to be treated the same with migrants into America. Also, we disbanded the Iranian nuclear deal. That happened about an hour ago. Basically, that deal said that we would both have arms, but we would never fire them at each other. And we're taking that out so that we can build our nuclear arsenal.
I thought it said that it blocked Iran from building more nuclear weapons.
Right, which is why you have it. They can have it, and you can keep it.
Yeah, but they were doing it in the background.
Yes. Basically, it gives us more of an opportunity to attack Iran if needed with nuclear weapons. Okay. Anyways, continuing, couple more minorities. Heading into the American Indian movement. So for those of you who did that chart yesterday, you're like, what's that last block? The American Indian movement. Basically what happens is on the anniversary of Wounded Knee, they are going to begin to advocate for remembering what the plight has been. Now the main thing is about reservations. What are the problem on these reservation systems? And they begin what is known as the Occupy movement. So if you want to write down Occupy movement, basically they're going to go and they're going to occupy. It's like a sit-in. Except it's a little bit more harsh than a sit-in, because rather than a sit-in just asking to be served, you're actually occupying the building and overtaking it. So nobody else can come in. That happened a couple of years ago. Occupy Wall Street. There was also the Occupy with Ted Bundy, when they occupied the Oregon offices, the BLM offices. It's basically where you overtake it. That's the idea here. Now, all of this was over what's going on at reservations. People didn't have water, people didn't have jobs, people had poor school, and they're going to advocate for that. Now, this organization, the American Indian Movement, actually continues until today. There's a lot of concern about water rights on the reservations, and they're going to advocate for that now. Now, the famous Occupy movement that's going to come from this, though, is going to be when they occupy Alcatraz, which, where do we know Alcatraz from? Well, San Francisco, and Al Capone, Roaring Twenties, and things like that. So what happens is that Alcatraz at this point has been abandoned. And so what's going to happen is this abandonment, they're going to overtake it and they're going to occupy Alcatraz for 9 months. And basically it's an Occupy movement. They're going to show and take a stand and create kind of like this camp on Alcatraz that's going to say, we have rights too. Now, if you go today, you can actually still see those stay there, and they kept them there. Now, part of the reason why Alcatraz ends up becoming a national monument is because when they finally took back over 9 months later, all of this stuff had been destroyed, and so they then began to rebuild it, and it's part of the reason it was a national historical monument. So now let's get into LGBTQ rights, which is known as the Stonewall Riots. Now, what happens is that in New York, there's a gay club known as Black Cat. And this was a very, very popular club for homosexuality. Now, what happens, though, is that the police didn't like homosexuality, as with most people in America. It was very faux pas. It was actually, up until the 70s, it was considered a mental disease at the same level as schizophrenia. So you actually had a mental disorder by being gay. So what happens is that at the Black Cat, the police are going to come and they are going to raid the Black Cat. And basically they're going to arrest people. It's going to turn violent. And it's going to kind of become this image of why we need expansion of LGBTQ rights in America. And what happens is because of this, they're going to begin riots. And they begin at what's known as the Stonewall Inn, which is right across the street from the Black Cat. So over at the Stonewall Inn, they're going to get together and they're going to agree that they are going to push for these rights in America. And it begins the gay pride movement in America. So you want to put next to it, like, begins gay pride movement, that's the Stonewall riots. So now it's not just a hidden in the closet thing. Now you're going to be more open about being gay. And what's going to happen is all throughout America, we're going to begin these gay pride, gay rights movements in order to be able to have more rights and stop these riots. Now, this whole thing was successful. It begins more of an openness for homosexuality in America. The biggest accomplishment, though, is that homosexuality is taken off the mental illness list. So mental illness, it can no longer be said as that. It's now a sexual orientation. Now, all of this contributes to the modern-day gay pride movement. This is where you get the marriage rules, or not marriage rules, the gay marriage law and the Supreme Court case that allows that to be able to happen, and also contributes to our continued gay pride movement in America. So it's kind of like a synthesis for you of how that impacts today. Now, the last one that we're going to talk about is counterculture. So with counterculture, next to counterculture, I would put odd ones out. They are going to take what's common in culture and they're going to push the boundaries. Every single generation has counterculture. We still have that today. It's basically the people that are going to break norms, they're going to push the boundaries, and they are going to do whatever they want because they are the counterculture. They don't care about society's rules. And this is basically defined as the hippie movement. So if you want to put right next to this, the hippie movement, that's where this is going to come out. Also put next to it and make sure you know it's Vietnam. Vietnam War vets, anti-Vietnam dissenters. This all is the whole like peace, love, equality movement in the 70s. Now, this all begins the creation of all of these large groups of people that are going to come together and advocate for freedom. They're going to advocate for peace. And they're going to advocate for a lot of other things that are kind of behaviors. So this is where you get into the drug movement and you start to get into all of that fun stuff, which I really don't think they'll ever ask you. But you can use that in a very academic way in an essay. Now, all of this hippie movement stuff, though, is defined as a counterculture. People thought it was very controversial. People thought that these guys were just, it's that, oh, you're just the hippies, right? It was that whole idea of you are against what the common culture wants. Now, all this culminates into an event known as Woodstock. Now, Woodstock is going to be this massive cultural and music celebration over 3 days in Texas. Now, Woodstock is going to end up having over 500,000 people go to it. And what I'll tell you about Woodstock is, number one, don't go Google pictures. Because I discovered that problem.
The school will block half of them.
Well, not when you first Google it. That's what I discovered. Here's what I'll tell you. Woodstock was defined as a revolution in many ways. It was a drug revolution, a sexual revolution. It was a bunch of stuff all at the same time. Now, Woodstock kind of I'm trying to say this as school appropriate as possible. I apologize. But Woodstock really does become known as the symbol of the hippie movement. It becomes known as the iconic imagery because Woodstock is, I think part of the reason people hated the counterculture so much was because the photos of Woodstock got published and people were like, who are these crazy people? But a lot of adults, you probably are related to somebody who would have supported the hippie movement. It was definitely it was a time period. It was the 70s, right? If you ever hear like, oh, that was just the 70s, that's where you get into all of this, which really begins a lot of our drug movement in America, like marijuana use especially. And LSD and all that fun stuff. Not fun stuff, because it's bad. Don't do drugs.
Were you just encouraging that?
No, I was not encouraging. Was this the class that said I was encouraging drinking when we did the game?
No?
Oh.
No.
One of my other class, because they said that, anyways.
You die in literally every situation from drinking. Why would they think that was encouraging?
It's because the one that you, Like it says one of the ones is like reject the man's offer and you still die. And they're like, oh, so we reject the drink and then we die. So you're saying we should accept it? That's not what I was saying. Okay, anyways, so that's it for lectures.